to give us this kind of figure. Of course, we then move on to the age of cinema. Now, most of you will recognise this as still from the 1922 classic German silent film Nosferatu. And what's interesting, again, those of you who are sort of aficionados of horror film history will probably know that Nosferatu was actually believed a lost film for a long time because Bram Stoker's widow sued the filmmakers for plagiarising Dracula, and she won, and it was ordered that all the copies were destroyed. You can see the resemblances if you've seen the film. Yes, obviously there are resemblances. You can also see that there are very significant differences. Now, one of the interesting things about this particular film is if you look at the credits, one character who doesn't get a lot of attention but perhaps should is a gentleman called Albin Grau. Now, Herr Grau is credited as being the art designer, the set dresser, etc. This is of particular significance in certain respects in an expressionistic film because the sets and that kind of thing are in many respects the stars of these pictures. It's also significant for people who have an interest in authenticity of occult representation in cinema, and not least because if you look carefully at the various parchments that are signed and details like that, then the symbolism is all entirely authentic. Somebody's done their homework, and the person who's done their homework is Albin Grau. Albin Grau is a member of the Ordo Templi Orientis. It's one of the most famous occult orders of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Probably the most infamous member was Aleister Crowley, the Great Beast, and indeed Crowley and Grau corresponded quite a while, though typically for Crowley they fell out. Getting back to vampires, Grau fought in the First World War, and during that period the regiment he was with were billeted in Serbia. And it wasn't an experience he had himself, but one of his friends in the army was billeted in a house where apparently there had been a vampire. The guy whose house it was, his grandfather, had returned from the grave and spread plague. So Grau, it's been suggested, was actually one of the major inspirations for this particular adaptation of Dracula. Of course, it's very noticeable that the vampire we have there, it's one of the few really monstrous vampires we have. He's not bloated, he's not red-faced as far as we can tell, but he's clearly quite inhuman. The other really notable thing about Nosferatu is, of course, that plague plays a big part in this film. That also is a level of authenticity. That's something people almost always forget when they're writing scripts for other vampire films, the plague aspect. I think there are elements of that in some of the Anne Rice books, and Anne Rice as well, I think, at one point sort of nods to the idea of our smelly peasants of the medieval European variety. So if we're looking for authentic vampires, the next representation I'd probably draw your attention to would be Night of the Living Dead. That may seem like a kind of curious choice, but the creatures depicted in Night of the Living Dead are much closer to the medieval Renaissance vampires of the authentic lore than almost any other representation. Not least because the way in which you kill these particular undead rather, is by just chopping them apart. And that's basically what you tended to do to vampires back in the day. Is staking was one of the options, but there was also a lot of chopping into pieces with shovels, burning, reading various religious mumbo-jumbo over them. And it's perhaps interesting to note that with Night of the Living Dead, I may be corrected if I'm wrong on this, but my memory is that there's no mention of the word zombie in the original Night of the Living Dead. I think the only mention we have is, I think they're referred to as ghouls. And ghoul could, if you wanted to stretch things, be the Arabic term for vampire. And some of the early critical appraisals of Night of the Living Dead saw it as being an interesting, exciting new direction for vampire films, rather than a new, the birth of a burgeoning subgenre of zombie films. And of course, previous to Night of the Living Dead, we had proper zombies who were like sort of voodoo-powered YTS people from beyond the grave. They're not flesh-eating corpses. They're people who've been perhaps died and are now employed as sort of a wage-free labour. Just to sort of go back to America briefly, and I'll try and cut this relatively short because it'd be nice to get a few Q&As and everyone have a chance to get a cup of coffee and a cigarette or whatever your poison might be. One of the interesting areas of survival of vampire folklore comes from New England in the States from the late 1800s, late 1700s through to the late 1800s. And there we have accounts of people who die of tuberculosis. It's an unpleasant lung disease, which, amongst other things, makes you cough up blood. And the idea was that it's also interesting at this point that tuberculosis is also known as consumption, which you might think is a peculiarly appropriate name for a disease associated with vampirism. What's odd about this is that once somebody dies in an area of tuberculosis, consumption if you prefer, when it starts to spread, the way you deal with it in rural New England is you dig this person up and you cut out their heart and burn it. And from my researches, I've been unable to find anyone actually involved in this who referred to these as vampires. They became vampires when the press started to cover them. But this is certainly something which Bram Stoker came across during his researches. So, you know, that's partially... And it's perhaps most interesting because there's an interesting theory about the American accent. While America might be the sort of epicenter of everything these days, back then it was very much a backwater. Everything took weeks, months, however long to get there, and it tended to remain sort of untouched. And so there's a theory, for example, that the American accent is much closer to the way people spoke in Elizabethan England than the current English accent, because everything was like frozen in amber there, effectively. And I suggest the same might also apply to local folklore. So what we're seeing in these curious accounts, and the last significant one was in 1892, and a young lady, rather unusually a young lady known as Mercy Brown. So, I mean, what I'm getting to really is that vampires are essentially plague demons. They're a way of describing how death is contagious. The language we use changes because, of course, going back hundreds of years, the people who spoke authoritatively on these things were priests dressed in black. These are the guys who explained how disease spread, how death might be contagious. Of course, we're now in an era where we listen to most of us listen to the guys in white coats who tell us it's something to do with bacteria. And we accept this, you know, he ought to know, though I think most of us would agree that we don't actually understand the process. For the sort of finale, I'd like to present to you, and if I'm wrong, I will buy whoever it is a pint, but this is perhaps one of my favourite cinematic vampires, and one I think none of you will have encountered before. And here he is. Allow me to introduce you to Count Spirachet, or Spirochete, I think it's correctly pronounced. He starred in a 1970, 72, 73, I suppose it doesn't really matter, 73, The Return of Count Spirochete. This particular production was put together by the American Navy, and Count Spirochete's hunchback servant was known as Gonorrhea, which gives you something of a clue as to the nature of this particular production. And this particular production was a public information film aimed primarily at sailors, trying to convince them not to catch syphilis, as embodied here by the Count, or indeed his sidekick Gonorrhea. So again, it's nice to see that sort of recent in time, that the sort of the connection between the plague and, of course, vampires continues to predominate. And, you know, you could, of course, speculate further on AIDS is the obvious one, but as we're running short on time, then I'll probably